Anyway, let's go to God, time of prayer. Oh God, may the meditations of all of our hearts and the words of my mouth be pleasing and acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, last May, you might have heard about this, maybe you didn't, but news broke about a Malaysian climber on the brink of death at the top of Mount Everest, who was also heroically rescued. So it was one of those, pull at your heartstrings, but a good ending sort of story. See, the climber was unable to speak when they found him, clutching onto a rope, lying on the ground in the snow, at a place that the climbers call the balcony, which is pretty close to the summit. He survived thanks to a man named Gentry Sherpa and others who would later join in the rescue effort. His rescuer, Gentry Sherpa, was an experienced climber who had performed dozens of rescues in the Himalayas, and in 2021 actually became the youngest person to summit K2, which is the world's second highest mountain. He was helping at this time a client ascend Mount Everest. And as they were ascending, they found this near-frozen man in the so-called death zone. They call it a death zone because it puts on extreme stresses on the body because of the very thin air and temperatures that drop below negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit, if you can even imagine that. My head cannot wrap around it. At that altitude, it is nearly impossible to breathe for more than a few minutes without supplemental oxygen. Most people bring up extra oxygen with them. And on top of that, successful rescue attempts tend to be rare. It's not always the case that they can rescue someone successfully. So there at more than 27,000 feet elevation, Gentry Sherpa convinced his client to turn back to save this man who was going to die. The Sherpa called it his most difficult rescue yet. Conditions were especially deadly that spring. 13 people had already died and 4 were still missing. It was the highest number of deaths in 8 years. So, Gentry Sherpa wrapped this man in a sleeping mat, strapped him to his back. Most elite climbers would find this brutal task, just the trek, extremely difficult on its own. But to do it while carrying someone who weighs about 150 pounds with gear and clothing, or 175 pounds, imagine yourself trying to do that, for more than just a few feet. I mean, trekking all the way down to a safety zone. And so together with another Sherpa, they carried this man for 2 hours until they were able to reach a base camp where he received some assistance in carrying this man for another 4 hours to a lower part of the mountain where he could be airlifted to the closest hospital. Whew, I'm exhausted just hearing about it. Because of this Sherpa's heroic efforts in helping the man who had been stranded in this frozen wilderness of the Himalayas, the climber survived. Few of us will find ourselves at the top of Mount Everest, and if you do, please film it and send it to me. I want to see it. But for the rest of us, we can identify in a different way at one time or another when it felt like we were lost or stranded or directionless by the wilderness of life's unexpected twists and turns. Welcome to a 7-week sermon series called Windows of the Soul that will take us through the end of May. In this series, we're examining different ways that God speaks and interacts and connects with our lives. In his book, Windows of the Soul, Ken Geyer writes this: our search for God and his search for us meet at the windows in everyday experience. These are the windows of the soul. So today, I'd like to give some thought to what Ken Geyer calls windows of the wilderness. What comes to mind when you hear the word wilderness? What do you think of? Like if you live here in the AV, you don't have to drive far. Just drive far enough from out of the city into the more remote parts of the high desert, right? It can definitely feel like a barren wasteland of tumbleweeds and Joshua trees, right? It's beautiful and yet very much wild. There are stretches of Pear Blossom Highway where I would not want my car to break down. Well, speaking of that, last November, there was a misadventure that happened off of I-15 South when certain drivers who were leaving Las Vegas for that big Formula One event, they got stranded in the wilderness because there was a dust storm that hit a certain section of I-15 that they had to shut it down for a little bit. And some people who were using Google Maps decided to pay attention to Google Maps advice. It suggested that there was an alternate route in which you could save 50 minutes. Well, it turned out to be a rocky dirt road filled with ruts and dips that was clearly not made for the average family car. And what they thought would save an hour on the trip home and turned into about a 5 or 6 hour delay, if not more for some people. Because for some, their cars were damaged or stuck, so much so that a tow truck had to come out and rescue them way out in the wilderness of the Mojave Desert. One definition of wilderness is uncultivated, uninhabited, and inhospitable region. See, there are moments and perhaps even seasons in our life when it feels like we are wandering through a wilderness. It doesn't seem very livable at that time. It feels like it's something we should just be passing through, and then we get stuck in it. And it can be lonely, as if we are traveling all by ourselves. And even at times, God can seem to be nowhere in sight. If you've ever lost someone dear to you, or if you've ever been let go from a job that you cared about, or fell into depression, or had a relationship fall apart, then you've been in the wilderness. And occasionally, in these moments of wilderness, it can feel like you're stranded on the top of the mountain, just hanging on for dear life, or like you're stuck in a terrible detour that you thought would be a shorter way home. You see, that same feeling was shared by an ancient Hebrew prophet in the 7th century BCE, whom we read about in the book of Habakkuk. It was a feeling that the whole southern kingdom of Judah felt as the Babylonian Empire invaded their land, conquered and enslaved the people, pressed in and in and in upon them. You see, not too long after the writing of Habakkuk, Babylon would eventually seize control of Jerusalem and raze the temple to the ground. The very symbol of God's presence with them, burnt to the ground in ashes. So in the 3rd chapter of Habakkuk, the prophet cries out for God to be faithful now, just as he's been in the past. He writes in verse 2, "O Lord, I've heard of your renown. I stand in awe, O Lord, of your work. In our own time, revive it. In our own time, make it known. In wrath, may you remember mercy." In Windows of the Soul, Ken Geyer writes about his own journey through the wilderness. He describes it in terms of pushing out into unknown waters. Sometimes he notes that you'll hear, maybe at graduation ceremonies, this poem called Invictus by W.E. Henley, which is supposed to be an inspiration as they embark on their next chapter of their lives. And it goes like this: "It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." See, Ken Geyer writes that it can feel adventurous and daring to sail off from the safe harbors of higher education to the high seas of whatever vocational choice that you've charted your life on. But what happens when the ship hits a reef? What happens when things go awry? Do you cling for dear life to whatever's left floating there in the water? Do you hope that some other captain will come to your rescue? Do you doggy paddle all the way to shore? You know, these are the questions that we're left with when we do enter those uncharted waters. You see, it's that intimidating what if, a list that we make of all the things that could possibly go wrong. That is the reason why some people would rather not venture out into unknown territory, right? Like, for example, committing to that volunteer position in the community that possibly could be extremely time-consuming and maybe even more demanding than we were prepared for. So, I don't know, maybe not take that risk. Or opening up our doubts or fears that to others that could potentially lead to judgment from others, that maybe our faith is lacking. Is that something that we're willing to risk? We're agreeing to share your story in front of a crowd or on a podcast about what you've learned about God that could potentially be a little scary. What if people dismiss you or disagree with your perspective? There's a risk involved. Author and retired professor Howard Macy wrote this: "We don't like risk. And even though the frontiers of spiritual growth require it, we prefer to avoid it." I mean, I don't know about you, but I can relate to that. He goes on to say that not only would we like to have the frontiers of the Spirit scouted out for us, but we'd also like to have the frontier fully tamed and settled like a new suburban development with well-lit streets, sewers installed already, established zoning codes, houses built and finished, shopping centers nearby, and everything finished save for the lawn and planting of shrubs. No pioneering for us, thank you very much. No danger from the dark wild, no felling trees or clearing boulders so that we can plant a garden, no climbing mountain passes or fording swollen streams, no climbing Mount Everest. We prefer comfortable safety to risk. And interestingly enough, it may be that it's actually part of our own physiology, that we're wired to be cautious. There's a part of our brain called the amygdala that works to protect us from danger. It pays attention to anything in the environment that appears to be a threat, and if it pops up, produces a fear response, right? A fight or flight type of event. And because of this, we might be safer for it, but also we become risk averse. Adam Hamilton writes, "This can be a wonderful blessing, can save your life even, but it can also keep you from living." Let that sink in. What if we don't go through the wilderness? What if we take that detour? What if we decide not to put ourselves out there in risk? What if we choose not to live? See, occasionally you take risks, right? And sometimes they don't work out, and sometimes they leave you stranded in the wilderness. When Ken Geyer finished seminary, he felt like the captain, right? With grand plans just beyond the horizon. Everything was hunky-dory. He planned to work as a professor. That's what he wanted to do, and use the summers to write. He had it all mapped out. Then his ship immediately ran aground, almost as soon as he started that. His grand plans of teaching and writing did not materialize right away, and one by one, he was turned down by every college and university where he put in his application to teach. Completely dejected and forced to make the best of things, his journey took a number of turns, from helping to start a small rural church for a couple years, to writing a children's novel, to selling oil field equipment for 2.5 years, to help fund his ultimate dream of becoming a writer. You know that phrase, the calm before the storm, right? Well, Ken had saved up enough money selling oil field equipment that he was finally able to pursue that nudge that he felt from God to write. His family moved to East Texas, where he walked every day to the college library to write from 8 to 5. But then he realized it was just the calm before the storm. He writes, "I discovered that the writing life was not the romantic cruise the travel brochures made it out to be, but rather one jarring rejection after another. Someone once said that writing is the only profession in which one can make no money without looking ridiculous." If you want to learn how to take rejection, become a writer, right? That's what Ken felt as he started to step into what he felt was his calling, right? And then immediately hit a wall. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in that situation when nothing seems to be working and you're doing everything you can to hide your embarrassments, right? Somehow appear like you're holding things together okay. Well, years went by, and Ken was not able to sell a darn thing. He began to question if God really had put this dream in his heart or if he just made a seriously lapse in judgment. Savings ran out. They had to liquidate their assets. They sold a car. They had to even sell some furniture. Eventually, they sold their house, moved into a vacant farmhouse that his wife's parents owned in a tiny rural town in the middle of nowhere. Talk about a ship running aground. He writes, I couldn't understand. When I felt so passionately about writing, worked so diligently, sacrificed so completely, why nothing was working out. Where was God in all of this? Why wasn't he helping me? Those are two questions that I think are timeless, that we often ask again and again. Where is God? Why isn't he helping? They're questions that many of us ask when we hit that difficult road. And it's what Habakkuk was asking as the people of Judah faced a hostile invasion and began to feel that their home had transformed from a blessing that God had given them to a conquered land that they no longer recognized, as if it were a strange wilderness. In a journal, a captain's log, if you will, that Ken kept going during his journey, Ken writes down that a passage that he had come across while reading scripture one day, he wanted to make sure that he was able to return back to it. And so he wrote this passage down from the end of Habakkuk, and it goes like this. Though the fig trees do not blossom, and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the olive fails, and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold, and there is no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer and makes me tread upon the heights. As we hear these words, these emotion-filled words, on the one hand, Habakkuk ends this book by describing a catastrophe, the economic collapse of a community, an ecological disaster, right? What a way to end a book. Utter crop failure, its effects on the livestock, no fresh or dried figs, no fig cakes, no fig-based medicines, no olive oil, no wine. In fact, all crops like wheat, barley, dates, pistachios, not ready to be harvested. Without flocks or herds, the loss is a devastating blow to the economy. Now, it's not really clear as we read this whether it's meant to be hypothetical, as if to say, no matter what comes my way, God, I will trust in you. Or perhaps this is some of the things that were actually happening in Judah as the invasion of Babylonian forces made it harder and harder to do their daily life. Whatever the case, it's a grim picture. Can we agree? Well, on the other hand, Habakkuk does not stop there. He keeps going after verse 17, and there is a vow to look to God for strength and salvation. Even in the face of impossible circumstances, there's still reason to rejoice, because God has not stopped working and will not abandon us. I love the analogy of the deer. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer and makes me tread upon the heights. I grew up in the upstate of South Carolina, where there are a lot of deer. Despite the fact that hunting is a very popular thing there, the deer population is actually often overpopulated, and the ecologists have to figure out what to do about it. And so I grew up seeing a lot of deer, even in my backyard. And as you look at deer, just even for a brief moment, you can tell that they are very light on their feet. They have to be, right? Because they're being stalked by predators or hunted by people. But it is amazing how quickly and nimbly they can dash here or there in any moment's notice. They're the ballerinas of the animal kingdom. So when Habakkuk takes courage, knowing that God will make them like the deer, he's saying that God will help them face the challenges at hand and even rise above them in the end. Thomas Renz writes, "In the present, having feet like deer means being sure-footed on difficult terrain. In the future, it will mean leaping freely upon the hills." In Ken Geyer's journal, in a different entry, he writes about the encounter with a family of stray cats that sometime after they had moved to this farmhouse. It was a mother, her 3 kittens, and they would wander over to the house when the elements got too rough, rain and things like that. They would crawl under the pier and beam foundation to seek shelter there. Ken noticed them, and so he started to leave food and a little milk out for them every single night. And sure enough, they'd come back again and again. But no matter how much time had passed, no matter how many great ideas he had to establish that trust with them, they remained afraid, standoffish at a distance. In fact, when he was able to get near to one finally, it arched its back, hissed, and swiped at him, not knowing that all that he wanted to do was to take care of them, give them a fighting chance rather than leave them to rough it in the wild. He reflected on this a little bit later, and then it dawned on him. He said, "Suddenly I realized that I was that kitten. Scared stiff one moment, spitting mad the next. Was that what God was wanting to do with me? To draw me close, to give me shelter and food and look after me?" But the shelter that I was wanting was the security of a job, not the security of his arms. The food that I was wanting was from the grocery store, not from his hand. See, it took a very long journey through the wilderness and many experiences to come to the conviction finally that one of the most powerful teachers is, in fact, the wilderness. No one wants to journey through it, but most people will come out on the other side completely changed. You see, God often teaches us, empowers us, and draws us closer when we're walking through it. Ken writes this, "As I look back on it, that passage from Habakkuk was a window of the soul, revealing what God wanted from me. He wanted me to trust that spring would follow winter, to live by faith, not by sight, to have Him, not success, be the source of my joy." I don't know about you, but that sometimes is a hard conclusion to come to, right? We don't always want those things that God has for us. We want the simple solutions. We want the easy, tangible things of life, right? But when God leads us through that wilderness, God can build us up in a way that we did not expect. So after what seemed like a lifetime of journeying in the wilderness, Ken discovered that God would not leave him there forever. In fact, he applied for many jobs, and finally, in a poetic unfolding of events, the only one that finally said yes was a writing job, the one that he desperately wanted, and the one that he knew that his gifts would be used. How amazing, right? There is a way out of the wilderness, right? But you have to stick with it and stay in it. He talks about how going through that wilderness actually made him a better writer. It helped him to understand the loneliness that people face, helped him to understand the feelings of desperation that people face. It helped him to understand what it means to be poor, what it means to be confused, what it means to be depressed or abandoned. All of those things he could suddenly understand from a first-hand experience. His writing became so much deeper and much more personal and moving. He says that seminary prepared me to use my gift, but the wilderness prepared me to live my life. One question for you today is, how is God helping you use those wilderness moments to prepare you for life? Are you going through a moment right now? What is that moment? How do you hear God speaking to you? Or do you feel like He's off, distant, and far away? Perhaps you can listen now. Perhaps God's still and small voice will find you if you keep going. And if you're not going through something like that right now, I guarantee you that there's someone in your life that is. And another question for us is, how can we go and be that courageous and supportive place of comfort for them? How can we cheer them on? How can we help them see the end of the tunnel? And how can we help them to grow in this time of wilderness? As we begin to wrap up this service shortly, and as we're about to head our way out, one question that we might ask is, how, oh God, are you wanting to grow me in this moment in my life right now?